I'm glad that William is here, particularly because he arrived about a minute ago. His timing, as ever, impeccable. And he's come virtually straight from Kabul, which he will tell you about. I was yesterday at the Edinburgh Book Festival talking to Jack Straw, the former Foreign Secretary. And he said he just finished reading William's book, Return of a King, and he said, the only trouble with that book is William didn't write it quite early enough. By that he meant that if he had known what he knew after reading this book at the time, maybe the history of Britain's involvement in Afghanistan might have been different. Who knows? Anyway, William is going to talk to you first, and then he's assured me that he will keep his talk short enough to allow me and you to ask him some questions. So, without further ado, William Dalrymple.
So, I'd like you to transport yourselves for a second from a dreich morning in the borders, the only time I've ever seen Traquair in pouring rain, very sadly, and move yourself to a drier, more distant spot out on the steppe between Mashhad and Herat, between eastern Iran and western Afghanistan. It's 1837. It's about 2 in the morning on a cold October night. The temperature in the desert drops very suddenly, and despite the fact that a war is about to break out, the new Shah of Iran, Mohammed II Qajar, is about to fulfill his coronation promise and invade over the border and try and take back for Iran the disputed border city of Herat. And he's marched his army up from Tehran. It's encamped outside Mashhad. But despite the fact that there's a war about to break out, it's 2 in the morning, it's dark, it's a moonless night, and the road is deserted. And then suddenly, a lone horseman appears trundling up the road. And even as you look at this guy, you can see he's completely exhausted. He's slumping forward in his saddle, and even as you're watching, you can see this guy kind of nod off and fall forward onto the mane of the horse, and he loses the road. Now, I'm not sure how long you can fall asleep on a horse and not fall off. Any riders got any ideas? Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, he falls off. He doesn't fall off. He stays on long enough to completely lose the road. And by the time he jerks awake, maybe loses his balance, whatever, he's out there in the desert, and he's no idea where he is. He tries to find his way back onto the road, and he makes it even worse. He gets lost, right lost. So that by 4 in the morning, he's really anxious. This is a war zone, it's a border. All the heroin that's heading towards Inner Leithen and Peebles, even today, starts along this route. And in 1837, it's still the opium route. It's just not the kind of place you want to get lost. And so he's very relieved when 5:30, 6 in the morning, the sun comes up behind the Kohi Shah Jahan mountains. And he can reorientate himself. He realizes where east and west is. He can head back. And he's heading back towards the military road. He's trying to get to the camp before the war breaks out. And then he sees the thing he least wants to see. He sees a whole line of armed horsemen coming up the valley towards him, cutting him off from the road he's trying to get onto. So what do you do in this situation? You're in the middle of nowhere, it's dawn, you're cut off, you do what any of us would do, you make yourself scarce, you hide. So he gets off his horse, he tethers it up, and he sits in this sort of overhang of rock, hoping that these horsemen won't see him, trying to see who it is that's coming towards him. Is it that Afghans going to invade Persia? Is it a bunch of opium smugglers? Is it the Inner Leithen Shinti team? Who is these guys coming towards him? And what he sees in the next 5 minutes changes the history of Central Asia and Afghanistan for the next century. Because what he sees coming towards him Actually, I won't tell you what he sees coming towards. So we'll just a bit of background. We've jumped ahead of ourselves. So, 1837. This is what 12 years after Waterloo. The French have been kicked out of the picture. Two imperial powers are competing to divide Asia between them. On one hand, you've got in the south, you've got the British. Not the British government. You've got the East India Company. One of the strangest and most sinister quirks of history is that India is conquered not by the British, as is often said. It's conquered by a public limited company. A company with a boardroom, annual general meetings, all the paraphernalia of a company, shares, shareholders, all that nonsense. And yet, what this company has, thankfully there is no modern equivalent. I mean, if it was, it would be sort of, Microsoft with armies or Pepsi-Cola with nuclear weapons or something. Because what this public limited company also has is the largest standing army in Asia. And over the past 50 years, they've used that army to conquer more of South Asia than Napoleon conquered of Europe. These company, which has been trading in India since 1599, the year that Shakespeare writes Hamlet, turns militaristic in the 1750s, a full 150 years after its creation. And between 1750 and 1837, where to date we are at this point, they have conquered almost all of India, right up to the Sutlej. Right up to the Sutlej. So everything to the south of the Punjab is either conquered or bound by treaty to the company. This aggressive, militaristic force, this sort of the ultimate example, in a sense, in world history of corporate irresponsibility. So, same time as all this is going on in South Asia, in the north, the Russians are moving south. Since the time of Peter the Great, they've conquered about 100 miles every decade. And any old buffer sitting in a pub in Pall Mall, or any old officer sitting in St. Petersburg, can see that these two voracious, aggressive, military European empires are coming towards each other, gobbling up great chunks of Asia. And at some point, anyone can also see, they're going to meet in the middle. They're going to meet somewhere in the unmapped territory that we today call Afghanistan. Then a variety of different emirates and little feudal principalities fighting with each other in this unmapped territory that only a century or two earlier had been the center of one of the great civilizations. Under the Timurids, Afghanistan was producing literature, learning, amazing tile work. It was the home of Bizard, the greatest of all the miniature painters. This place, which has been fought over since then for 150 years, unmapped, is clearly about to fall to European adventurers. But which one? And so what our young officer on his horse sees in that morning in 1837 matters, because what he sees is not brigands, it's not the Shinty team, it's not the Afghans or the Persians. What he sees is an entire regiment of fully armed Cossack soldiers heading into Afghanistan. And for a young intelligence officer, this is the weapons of mass destruction of its day. This is the piece of evidence that everyone's been looking for, unequivocal evidence there are Russians going to Afghanistan. Except it's not actually the weapons of mass destruction, it's more like the yellow cake, because it's not what it seems. It is, in fact, a tentative, possible, unofficial effort to open diplomatic relations with Afghanistan by Russia. It's not, emphatically not, a Russian invasion of Afghanistan or the beginnings of a Russian invasion of India, which is what a group of ideologically driven hawks turn it into as propaganda, as a way of going to war. Now, it's impossible to imagine today, of course, that a group of hawks could sit there, manipulate evidence, send an entire nation to war. It just couldn't happen today. We have too many checks and balances in the system. But I'm sad to say it does happen then. And we get irresponsible people saying things like this. We should declare that he who is not with us is against us. We must secure Afghanistan. This is the British ambassador in Tehran in 1837. A guy called Sir John McNeill, who's related to all the McClues and is the old Duchess's great-great-grandfather. So Borderer is responsible for this terrible act of propaganda. And the wheels of government turn. By 1839, the largest army the East India Company has fielded for 150 years is in the field in Firozpur and the Punjab. They have 30,000 troops, 40,000 camp followers, 50,000 camels. It's an enormous force. There are 3,000 camels carrying nothing except the regimental wine cellar. The largest general needs 250 camels to carry just his uniforms and his medals. There are 30 camels that carry nothing except cheroots and cigars, and there is one camel that goes all the way into Afghanistan carrying nothing but eau de cologne. What they haven't thought to bring, though, is a map. They don't have a map. There is no map. So off they go. And you see these pictures of these guys going off all over the hills, and the classic sort of Indian scene, you know, where, which is the way to Afghanistan? Go straight, son, go straight. And they're all completely lost. But eventually, a few of them, they lose about a quarter of the troops en route. And it's the technical term, I think, is a goat fuck. And they get completely lost. They die of thirst. They drop dead of heat. But by the sheer momentum of it, they get through the Bolan and the Kojak passes. By the time they capture Kandahar, the rulers of Kandahar have fled. There's no battle. Shah Shuja, the old Afghan ruler who's been pulled out of retirement, but 30 years of retirement, is placed back on the throne. And within another 6 weeks, they are in Kabul. And it's been an incredibly easy conquest. And everyone's feeling pretty smug. It's very like 2001 December. Afghanistan falls. Hardly a casualty in terms of warfare. Many people died of thirst and hunger, but no one died from bullets because there was no resistance. And it seems like an incredible putsch. These guys have marched in, they've leapfrogged over the Sikh Empire in the Punjab, which occupies what's now the landmass of modern Pakistan. They've leapfrogged over, and they've conquered the whole of Central Asia. In a single putsch, they have captured the vital crossroads which links Central Asia, Samarkand, Bukhara, Khiva, with Delhi, that links Iran with China. It's a kind of, on the map, it looks absolutely fantastic. And it soon sort of gets going. The Memsahibs are brought up from Simla. Lady Sale comes with her unmarried daughter, with her grand piano and seeds from her kitchen garden in Agra. And by the next season, she's writing in her diary, if I can find the right quote, "My sweet peas and geraniums were much admired, and in the kitchen garden, the potatoes especially thrive. And there's cricket and horse racing and open-air amateur theatricals, and there's winter draws in, there's duck shooting, skating, snowman building. Alexander Burns, the kind of slightly randy man from Forres, who is the deputy resident, whose libido will get him in trouble later, throws a Christmas party with Scottish reels and bagpipes and does a jig on the table. And already there is discreet talk of annexing Afghanistan and adding it to the British Empire. And in the smugness of this period, the British don't fortify themselves in a fortress, they don't build a fort, they don't build any kind of military. They just lay out a cantonment in the valley outside Kabul, and they dig eventually a small ditch and a small wooden palisade around it. Inside there's tents and barracks. It's not a fortified enclosure. In fact, it's overlooked on every side. And even the incredibly dim military chaplain, the Reverend Gleig, can see that this one is not going to fly. There's only got to be kind of a few guys with pea shooters or slings on the hilltops so they can throw stones in the cantonment. But everyone is so pleased with capturing it. They're also confident that they think that this is going to be fine, and they don't think twice. And then again, unimaginable today, the West goes off and it invades somewhere else, and it takes its eye off the ball in Afghanistan. Not in this case Iraq, Hong Kong. The British go and fight the Opium War in 1841, one of our most honourable battles for free trade ever. The right to sell heroin to the Chinese. We've got to be proud of our forebears here. And they invade China, they destroy the Summer Palace, they take Hong Kong by force, and in the meantime they drain Afghanistan of troops. So what had been a huge army is down to only 4,500 troops, and supported by 18,000 camp followers. And of those, only 700 in Kabul are Europeans. The rest are sepoys from Bihar and Bengal who've never seen snow before and are completely unsuited for the kind of mountain warfare that you need in Afghanistan. And then the accountants get to work. And what originally looked like a really good idea, invading Afghanistan, it turns out to be completely economically draining, which all armies find with Afghanistan. You can conquer Afghanistan. It's not difficult. Army after army. Contrary to myth that Afghanistan has never been conquered, the point is it's been conquered by everyone. It's been conquered by the Kushans, the Greeks, the Macedonians, the White Huns, the Timurids, the Mongols, the Mughals, anyone who wants to. The Persians, they've all conquered Afghanistan. But the point about Afghanistan is it's very, very poor and very, very mountainous. So it costs a lot to garrison and you can't exploit it. If you go and invade Iraq, you can go and run off with the oil. But if you invade Afghanistan, there's not much to run off with. And so the accountants get to work. They say it's too expensive. It's destroying the profit of the East India Company. It's putting us into the red. We're having to borrow money rather than mint it, which is the whole point of empire. And so they cut the troops further. And more seriously, they cut the subsidies to the frontier tribes. Now, the frontier tribes, the Ghilzais, the Afridis who control the Khyber Pass, everyone's always paid them. They basically get paid protection money by whoever's in charge, Radari, road tax. And later on, the British will do that too. The imperial doggerel was thrash the Sindhis, beat the Baluch, but just pay the bloody Pathans. If you pay them, they keep quiet, they keep the roads open. If you don't pay them, they make trouble. And so they cut the subsidies to the Ghilzais. The next day, the post boys are found with their throats slit. And the garrison in Kabul is completely cut off, not just from India, but even from the outlying garrisons in Jalalabad and Kandahar. And it's winter. You've got now snow billowing in, and it's all not looking good. And at this particular moment, Alexander Burns, the guy in the kilt, decides to go and sleep with the girlfriend of one of the leading noblemen in Kabul. It's not going to end well. So Abdullah Khan Achakzai, who is the man in question, gathers his mates and makes this speech. Now we are justified in throwing off the English yoke. They stretch their hand of tyranny to dishonour private citizens great and small. Fucking a slave girl isn't worth the ritual bath that follows it. But we have to put a stop to it right here, right now. Otherwise, now remember this, gentlemen, otherwise the English will ride the donkey of their desire into the field of stupidity. Now, we've all done that in our time, but don't do it in Afghanistan. It's a very, very bad idea. And it doesn't go well for Alexander Burns. Abdullah Khan Achakzai and his mates burns down the house. Burns runs out in native dress. He gets his head chopped off. They kick them all around for a while, the head around for a while as a football. Then they hang up the trunk in the bazaar on a butcher's hook. Every pissed off Afghan in Afghanistan descends on Kabul in the next 24 hours. The British governor, Macnaghten, goes out to negotiate and he's shot dead by the negotiators. The British general, Elphinstone, a good borderer, is riddled with gout, who hasn't seen action since Waterloo, gets onto his horse, he falls off the horse falls on him, and that's the end of Elphinstone. The British have very cleverly put all their supplies and all their ammunition and all their field guns in an undefended sort of gun park just outside the walls of Kabul. The Afghans overrun it in 24 hours, and soon they're pulling all the British cannons onto the hills around the cantonment and shooting down into the cantonment. The British first eat their beagles and their foxhounds, then they eat the horses, then they eat the rats, then they surrender. It's all over. And they get quite good terms. How long have we got?
You've got another 10 minutes.
10 minutes, good. So they get quite good terms. They're allowed to go out with all their arms and all their ammunition and their colours. And they make a very impressive-looking treaty with the nobles in Kabul. But of course, the Ghilzais and the Afridis and all the tribesmen up in the hills have got no intention whatsoever of abiding by anything that these guys in Kabul are signing. So already they've worked out that the East India Company musket, the Brown Bess, only fires about 300 yards, while their heavy, old-fashioned, slow-loading Jezzails fire over half a mile further downhill. So they build slit trenches all the way along the passes, out of the range of the British guns, preparing like snipers, getting their positions ready. On the 6th of January 1842, the British march out of Kabul. Among them is my great-great-uncle, a guy called Colin Mackenzie. He writes, at 9 a.m. the troops moved off, a crouching, drooping, dispirited army. So different from the smart, light-hearted body of men they appeared some time ago. The men sinking a foot deep in the snow with each step. My heart sunk under the conviction that we were a doomed force. I always remember as one of the most humiliating sights of that dreadful day, fixing my eyes by chance on a little Hindustani child, perfectly naked, sitting in the snow, with no mother or father near her. She was a beautiful little girl, perfectly naked, sitting in the snow, just 2 years old. Strong enough to sit upright and her legs doubled underneath her, hair curling in waving locks around a soft little throat, and her great black eyes dilated to twice their normal size. Many other children as young and innocent I saw slain on the road, and women with their long dark hair wet with their own blood. The rear guard had to fight the whole way to Bugram Me and pass through a literally continuous line of poor wretches, men, women and children, dead or dying from colds or wounds, who, unable to move, entreated their comrades to kill them and put an end to their misery. So we have the soldiers, the cavalry out first. They go over the bridge and out. Next come the infantry. Finally come the poor old camp followers, the guys who are just putting the tents up with all the baggage. And of course the Afghans pour out of Kabul, land on the baggage and pinch it all. And because the cavalry and the infantry are ahead, there's no one left to defend the baggage. So by 4 o'clock, the cavalry arrive at the first camping spot. Where's my tent? Where's dinner? Where's the bearer? No sign of bearer, no sign of drink, no sign of bath, no sign of bearer. By 6 o'clock, it's -10, and there's still no bath, there's still no tent. By 10 o'clock, it's -30. The whole horizon is lit up with the burning orange of the cantonments. There's no going back. And there's no food, there isn't a drop to eat, there isn't a bite to eat, isn't a drop to drink, there are no tents, and it's -30. What do you do in that situation? It's 6 days' march to Jalalabad. Well, Colin Mackenzie's Jezailchis, the Afghan mercenaries, they know what to do. They have their little trowels that they carry with them, and they have their meal. So they make little fire, they dig with their trowels a round circle in the snow down to the ground. They light a fire in the middle, and they huddle together, body to body, with their clothes over them, because they know that if they don't have their body heat and they don't have their fire, they're going to wake up. They're not going to wake up the following morning. And indeed, the poor sepoys, these guys from the plains of Hindustan that never get snow, that don't know about cold, they just lie down in the snow, and about a third of them don't wake up the following morning. The other 2/3 wake up with feet looking like charred logs of wood. They've got frostbite. They can't do anything. They can't fire their guns. They're completely incapacitated. And entirely through to bad management. It's quite easy to survive outside. You huddle next to other people. You cover yourself with snows. You sit by a fire. You do all that. At this point, the Afghans appear from behind and drive this ragtag. Only after 1 day, they've had nothing to eat. They've got frostbite. They're completely screwed into the Kul Kabul, where the big massacre, the big ambush is waiting for them. Lady Sale is at the front. The confusion was fearful. We had not proceeded half a mile when we were heavily fired upon. The pony Mrs. Sturt rode was wounded in the ear and the neck. I fortunately had only one ball in my arm, one musket ball in my arm. 3 others passed through my cloak near the shoulder without doing me injury. It's a great Victorian line. I fortunately had only one musket ball in the shoulder. The pass completely choked up for a considerable period. We were stationary under heavy fire. That night, the sepoys and camp followers, half frozen and starved, tried to force their way not only into my tent, but into my bed. Many poor wretches died around the tent that night. Women and children were abducted. So, there are 18,500 men, women and children, of whom 4,000 are armed troops, who leave on the 6th of January. By the second day, it's down to about 10,000. 3,000 have died of cold, and the remainder, the other 2,000 have been killed in the Kul Kabul. They then have to climb the Tezeen Pass, the highest point in the journey, and there they get caught in an enormous blizzard. 5,000 come down the other side. At the bottom, the Ghilzais have prepared the mother of all ambushes at the narrowest point in the path, which they block with holly hedges, spikes, thorns, everything they can muster. And the sepoys hit this just after dusk at about 6 a.m. as they're coming down. Already they're half blinded because of the snow. And no one can see what's going on. The cavalry ride over the infantry. Men are caught and impaled on the equivalent of the wire on these thorns. 200 only make it over that hedge. They are surrounded at dawn the following morning in a village called Gundamuk. 10,000 Afghans surround them. They have 2 rounds each left. They fire their rounds, they do a couple of bayonet charges, then they're all shot down. 1 man is taken hostage. 10 cavalry make it onto the Nimla gardens. They haven't eaten for 4 days. The gardeners who are there offer them naan and must, bread and yogurt. They get off their horses, they eat their breakfast, and they're clubbed to death by the gardeners. 1 man, Dr. Bryden from Nig in Inverness, makes it through to Jalalabad. He survives only because he would have been here at the Borders Festival. He had a copy of Blackwood's magazine tucked into his forage cap. And when they tried to beat him with the sword, it went through the hardback binding, but it didn't go through his head. Always carry a hardback book on your head next time you go to Afghanistan. He makes it through. The rest is wiped out. This is Britain at the peak of its imperial power, at the very height of its economic power. And it isn't just an army defeated, it's an army wiped out in its entirety. 40 hostages are taken to trade off against Dost Muhammad's harem and his family, who are in British exile in India. Other survivors, the very few sepoys who have not been frostbitten or wounded, they are sold to Uzbek slave owners. The Uzbeks have a very nice and attractive way of dealing with their slaves. They take a horsehair rope and they take a needle, which they use for carpet manufacturing, and they sew a rope through the clavicle of under the chest bone of their hostages, and then attach it to the saddle of their horse. Their hands are tied behind your back, and you and 5 of your friends are attached by your collars to the horse. If you stumble, if you don't keep up, your whole chest frame is ripped open, agonizing. Nonetheless, 2,000 sepoys make it to the slave markets of Bukhara, and some of them escape. Those sepoys who escape, including Subadar Bakht Khan, are those who lead the Indian uprising of 1857. We call it Indian Mutiny, they call it the First War of Independence. The Lady Sale is taken back, and she sees these horrors as she passes. We passed 200 dead bodies in 100 yards. Many of them were Europeans, the whole naked and covered with large gaping wounds. What she doesn't say in the printed version, but it's in her diary, is that the Afghans cut off the genitals of the male sailors and stuff it in their mouths, which is the sign of the ultimate degradation of what you do with you desecrate a corpse as the sign of your hatred of the enemy, of the Kafirs. As the day advanced, several poor wretches of Hindustanis, camp followers who'd escaped the massacre of the night before, made their appearance from behind rocks and caves, where they'd taken shelter from the murderous knives of the Afghan and the inclemency of the climate. They'd been stripped of all they possessed, and few could crawl more than a few yards on their hands and knees, being frostbitten in the feet. Here Johnson found 2 of his servants from Delhi. One had his feet frostbitten, and the other had a sword cut on one hand and a musket ball in his stomach. The other had his right arm completely cut off to the bone. Both were utterly destitute, stark naked, and had not eaten food for 5 days. Wounded and starving, they'd set fire to bushes and grass and huddled together to impart warmth. Subsequently, we heard that scarcely any of these poor wretches escaped from that defile. Driven to extremes of hunger, they sustained life by feeding off their dead comrades. So slavery, cannibalism, wipeout. It couldn't get worse. But for the Afghans, what Bannockburn is to us, what the Easter Rising is to the Irish, what Garibaldi is to the Italians, what Yorktown is to the Americans, this is to the Afghans. The man who supervised the rout, Dost Muhammad Khan and his son Wazir Akbar Khan, are the great heroes of Afghan nationalist myth. The diplomatic area where Sherrod Cooper Coles, who was here last year, and the British Embassy is based now, is based in Wazir Akbar Khan, the guy who supervised the massacre. And this is the central event. And the family of Shah Shuja, the Quisling we put in last time, are reviled as the greatest Quislings in Afghan history, which is a problem for Shah Shuja's direct descendant, whose name is Hamid Karzai. We put the same guy in twice. It didn't end well the first time. Here is Mirza Atta, the Afghan historian, writing in 1846. Already the numbers have swelled. It is said that 60,000 English troops, half from Bengal, half from other provinces, without counting servants and camp followers, went to Afghanistan, and only a handful came back alive, wounded and destitute. The rest fell with neither grave nor shroud to cover them, and lay scattered in that land like rotting donkeys. For the English love gold and money so much that they cannot stop themselves from laying their hands on any area productive of wealth. But what prize did they find in Afghanistan except on one hand the exhausting of their treasury and on the other hand the disgracing of their army? It is said that 40,000 English troops had left Kabul. The rest perished in the mountains like a ship sunk without trace. For it is no easy thing to invade and occupy the kingdom of Khorasan. If the English had been able to keep Afghanistan, would they ever have left this land where 44 different types of grape grow, and other fruit as well? Apples, pomegranates, pears, rhubarb, mulberries, sweet watermelon and muskmelon, and ice water that cannot be found in all the plains of India. For these Indians know neither how to dress nor how to eat. God save me from the fire of their dal and their miserable chapatis. One last anecdote. Hello.
You've got minus 5 minutes.
So, retracing the route of the retreat, I went back to Gandamak to try and see the final site of the last stand and have this conversation with the elders. And I'll just end with that. It's exactly the same, they said. Both times the foreigners have come here for their own interest, not for ours. They say, we are your friends, we want to help, but they are lying. Whoever comes to Afghanistan, even now, they will face the fate of Burns and McNaughton. We are the roof of the world. From here you can control and watch everything. Afghanistan is like a crossroads for every nation that comes to power, but we do not have the strength to control our own destiny. Our fate is determined by our neighbours. One of the elders from Gandamak told me this story. He said, last month, some American officers called us to a hotel in Jalalabad for a meeting. One of them said to us, why do you hate us? And I replied, because you blow down our doors, enter our houses, you pull our women by the hair, and you kick our children. We cannot accept this. We will fight back, and we will break your teeth. And after your teeth are broken, you will leave. Just as the British left before you. It's just a matter of time. What did he say to that, I asked. He turned to his friend and said, if the old men are like this, what will the younger ones be like? In truth, all the Americans know their game is over here. It's just their politicians who deny it. This, he said, is the last days of the Americans. Next, it will be China. Thank you. How are we doing?
Very well done. Very good. So why did we do it? We did it then, as you read this fascinating book, we went in, as William has indicated, because we feared that Russia was launching a takeover of India. This time we went in for different reasons. But what emerges from the book, it's not that we didn't know, there weren't people who didn't know Afghanistan, didn't understand it. There are people, mostly Scots, as far as I can see.
The odd Ulsterman.
The odd Ulsterman, who really understood the country extremely well. And Alexander Burns, who's the chap you refer to, is not just a kilt-wearing country dancer. He really knows the language. He's lived in Kabul. He knows it intimately. But his advice is ignored, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, I didn't quite understand, why was the people who really knew the country, why was their advice ignored? He wanted, we just backed the wrong guy.
The situation is that you get, as the Governor-General, this guy parachuted into India, Lord Auckland, who's completely hopeless. He's the direct ancestor of Anthony Eden, who the man for Suez. So this family have two of the great fiascos of British imperial history to answer for. And Auckland knew nothing about India, knew even less about Afghanistan. And he finds himself in the grip, rather like Dubya, sitting there reading My Pet Goat on 9/11, in the hands of a group of ideologically driven hawks who have a plan. They know what they want. And their plan has nothing to do with strategic necessity. It's all to do with ambition and their own personal theories on the great game. So he's shoved into the hands, particularly this idiot McNaughton, who I'm glad to say, despite the muck, is an Ulsterman rather than a Scot. And Macnaghten is really responsible for messing it up. He allows cuts which he knows are going to endanger the troops. He ignores all the signs that there's a growing rebellion. He has all sorts of crack guys. I mean, if you chose an A-team of Orientalists to be there in the occupation, you almost never have a better bunch of advice. I mean, not only Alexander Burns, one of the greatest writers on Central Asia ever, but also Henry Rawlinson, who translates half the ancient languages who deciphers cuneiform. I mean, you have these bunch of complete geniuses, all these sort of fellows of all souls lined up as provincial governors, and they're all telling Macnaghten to what's happening, and he's ignoring it. So the problem is not that it was always going to be difficult. It was always going to be hugely loss-making, and it's the economy in the end that screws it up then as now, because we haven't been defeated even now, but just people can't afford. There's no benefit for your...
But you say it was always going to be difficult. Was it always going to be impossible? If we got all those things right...
It had all... The reason that the Kabul garrison are killed is the incompetence of the commanders. You have a hopeless governor, Macnaghten, a completely gout-ridden idiot as a general, and a tricky one-armed idiot called Shelton as the brigadier under him. And those three screw it up. The same did not happen in Kandahar or in Jalalabad, where you had competent generals sail and not. Even so, though, even if you had the most competent team, the A-team, on the ground, running things efficiently, you could have fended off the rebels and you might not have lost an army, but you could not nonetheless have afforded to have held Afghanistan, because it would have been a hugely loss-making enterprise. So sooner or later we would have pulled out.
Yeah. And this time around, different circumstances, obviously, but at the same time, there seems to have been a sort of failure to identify the people we should have been talking to, perhaps. I know there's another writer, James Ferguson, who believes that we could have talked to the right members of the Taliban, and none of this need have happened. Could we have got that right, or was it a case that as soon as the Americans started blasting their way in a sense, we were lost?
I think, again, it could have been done. When Karzai came back, he was incredibly popular. The Taliban were absolutely hated. But what happened at a district level is that the Taliban were Ghilzai. It's all tribal. And it's the same tribal conflict as this war is. The Taliban were Ghilzais. They had gained, underneath all the paraphernalia of Islamic fundamentalism and destroying cassette tapes and the Bamiyan Buddhas, it was the first time that the underdog tribe had got control. And they put their guys across the country, every level, district, town, village. When the Durrani Pashtuns, who are the kind of toffs of the Afghan world, came back under Karzai is as posh and well-born an Afghan as there is. It's like making the Maxwell Stuarts kings of Scotland again, would be the direct parallel.
He knows his home territory.
I know where my bed is. My toast is buttered today, anyway. They replaced the Ghilzai governors, mayors, village headmen at every level. So all those guys just went back into opposition. And had they been left alone, probably they'd have gone back to the fields and just accepted their own. But they were hunted down. And so they, having buried all their arms, they then got them out again. They were then funded by Pakistan. I mean, it's a long, long story. Everything has gone wrong at every stage. Yeah. As it is, though, where we stand today, it's an interesting situation because, I mean, rather like in Egypt, you have this desperate balance where the country seems to be divided almost 50-50, or certainly 60-40, pro-army and pro-Muslim Brotherhood. So you have a situation whereby the north of the country, north of Kabul. Kabul is rather like Stirling is the class between the lowlands and the highlands. Kabul controls is the dividing line in Afghanistan between the Pashtun south and the Tajik and Uzbek north. Everything north of Kabul is still hugely anti-Taliban and will never support a Taliban takeover. South, the Pashtuns are divided, and it's a tribal thing. There are certain tribes like the Likozai who are very, very pro. And the Hoteki Ghilzai, who are very pro-Taliban and will always be so. And then there are those who are pro-government. So what is going to happen is you have enough pro-Taliban tribesmen to create a huge amount of trouble, to let off a lot of bombs, to do kidnapping, but probably not, almost certainly not enough to run over the country again, like they did last time. And the big change in Afghanistan over the last 10 years has been that the cities have grown by a factor of 10. Kabul, which was something like only 300,000 in 2001, is now 3 million.
Yes.
And this has happened across every provincial town, even small places like Farah are now 10 times the size they were. And the town dwellers do not support the Taliban either. It remains a rural thing in the Pashtun south. And so what you're going to get is a long-running insurgency, but not a nice clean break of any sort.
No. Just one question before I ask for questions from the audience. You've been in Kabul and you've been talking to Karzai at some length. And I mean, do you feel that he is a chap who can survive, or is he, like, as you said, like Shah Shuja, have we backed the wrong man?
Well, he's extremely charming, well-educated. I mean, I've never talked to anyone. He watches Last of the Summer Wine. He reads the oral newspaper, The Times. His favourite book is John Betjeman. I never heard of it. Tea Cakes and Trains or something, or Tennis Whites. And I mean, he's kind of ridiculously Anglophile. His favourite
tea cakes and tennis whites.
Tea cakes and tennis. I mean, it's such a gift. This guy is someone that should be so much in our pocket. He sits there waxing about how wonderful the British Raj is. He went to school in Simla, he loves Simla, happy memories and he got an Anglo-Indian to teach him idiomatic English, which is why he speaks this extraordinary English.
So we backed the wrong man.
But he was, in that sense, he's great. But we pissed him off. He has been led. He has seen so many ridiculous errors that he has calculated they can't possibly be errors. It has to be a conspiracy, and he genuinely believes, strongly, that the British and the Americans have done a deal with Pakistan to give over the south of the country to the Taliban. So he is now in a position where he's happy, basically, to go it alone without any foreign aid.
But that's precisely what Shah Shuja thought.
Precisely.
Isn't it?
It's why he likes the book.
Right. We've got, I'm being told, 5 minutes, but actually I'm going to make it 10 for questions from the audience. So quick, if you want to ask any questions, shove your hand up now and wait for the microphone to come to you. Hello? Stick your hands up, by the way, if you want, and I'll come to you.
On Karzai, William, it's often said that he's corrupt. That's the single adjective most used about him in the press. Is he unusually corrupt by Afghan standards, or is he just the norm?
On the contrary, I think he's not. He personally is not corrupt at all. And in fact, even in Afghanistan, he's known to be unusually clean. But he tolerates massive corruption in his immediate family. And his half-brother, Ahmed Wali Karzai, married into the family of the biggest smuggling family ancestrally. I mean, their job was running guns into the northwest frontier 200 years ago, and now it's heroin today. So Ahmed Wali Karzai, again, was probably not directly, personally involved in the drug trade, but his brother-in-law ran it. Meanwhile, Mahmoud Karzai, who was the elder brother of Hamid Karzai, the president, he was a waiter in a restaurant in San Francisco 10 years ago. He's now the biggest business tycoon in Afghanistan. He has a hat. He's like in Pakistan. He's like the president of Pakistan. He's Zardari. He has a cut and everything. So when Toyota wanted to come to Afghanistan, they got him on the board, and he got 10% of every Toyota sold. When the cement company wanted to come in, they made him on the board, and so he's on every board. When the Kabul bank opened, they gave Mahmoud Karzai 25% of the shares, just as a present. And they gave another general called Fahim, his brother. So they had the brothers of the two big, the president and the vice presidents, were given 50% of the bank, which is why it's collapsed. And there's a big, he's building a kind of Milton Keynes outside Kandahar, which is never going to work. and the idea was that all these exiles would come back from Los Angeles and San Francisco and build dream Californian houses. And these sort of wonderful sort of things that are part ziggurat, part Swiss chalet, part sort of mogul, but with a bit of sort of Casa Nostra Baroque added on, coming up all over. And as soon as they get there, of course, the kidnappers turn up and they sort of, kidnap the children and send back the leg in the post and this sort of stuff. So it's all a fiasco.
Right, we've got one more question. One question at the back there and one here. If you just wait for the microphone.
Do you believe that Obama will in fact pull out of Afghanistan?
He's definitely going to pull out of Afghanistan. The question is whether they go for what's called the zero option. At the moment, what America wants is to sign a strategic partnership agreement, SPA, with Obama, which will allow America to have bases in the country, including Bagram Air Base, and in return for support for the regime and an arms flow. And everyone assumed this was going to be, as a matter of course, was going to be signed, and this was going to be the way out. And there is a good argument for saying that Afghanistan can survive without the American troops, and that they've been so incredibly criminally lax in their supervision of attacks. They frequently, even when they just installed Karzai, his entire tribe came up from Uruzgan to celebrate his coronation, his installment. And the Americans bombed it as a Taliban convoy and killed off half his supporters from his own village. And this has gone on. This incredibly lax targeting, this very, very faulty intelligence has carried. The British suffered exactly the same thing. That basically you get a local guy, you employ him as your informer, and he just tells you to blow up his ancestral rivals. He said, these guys supporting the Taliban. And this has gone. So everyone has suffered from this, and the Afghans are very good at just using the occupation as a way of killing off their old blood feuds, of executing their blood feuds at one remove.
We've got a question here.
Could you kindly tell us what hope for the future you have?
So I suppose the best case scenario is, some de facto Hezbollah situation, whereby you have an armed militia in the south of Afghanistan who getting on, allowing the functioning of the government, but will retain their enter into the political process, retain their weapons, but not screw the whole thing up. The worst case scenario, of course, is just a straightforward civil war again, with the north against the south, with Pakistan supporting the Pashtun south and the Indians supporting, and Iran supporting the Northern Alliance, and the Kabul reduced to rubble. I personally think that probably, it can happen, and might happen. But I think at the moment there's still a chance that there's some sort of negotiated solution of some sort. Whether Karzai and his dynasty survive, Karzai has to step down this year. And so he personally is unlikely, and he's made it clear in interviews. There's lots of speculation in Afghanistan that he will find some loophole to declare a state of emergency and stay on. But he assured me over and over and over and over again that he wasn't. That he's building a palace for himself outside the palace where he can live in the future. He's going to guide the next president. He's not going to support his family to stand. So he went at some length and detail into his plans. So I think it's going to be violent. It's going to get worse, and the level of violence that we're seeing in Afghanistan is going to accelerate. But I don't think we're going to see a massive civil war. Certainly not immediately, and I don't think the least likely scenario is the Taliban just rolling over the whole country again. That's not going to happen.
That, I'm afraid, I'm being told, is it. But I'm going to take the opportunity of just the one remaining few seconds just to say that William has referred to Dr. John Brydon, the last man, the only survivor of the British defeat. And when he came back in retirement, he went to live in a house in Nig, which is in Rothshire, by the way, not Inverness, in a wonderful house, which is the house where I grew up, in overlooking the Cromarty Firth. And in the grounds, there is a railed-off graveyard. And we were always told that in that graveyard were the remains of the horse that took him out. That, unfortunately, William's book disabuses me of that idea, because the horse didn't survive, and God knows what happened to it. But anyway, Dr. John Brydon.
Because Brydon then, as if being the only survivor of the biggest imperial catastrophe of its generation wasn't enough for one life. He then goes and brilliantly locates himself in the residency in Lucknow in 1857 and goes through the other great imperial trauma. And he survives both the retreat and dies in his bed on the Cromarty Firth.
A great survivor.
Not in Inverness.
A great survivor. A great survivor like our author today. So please, will you join with me in thanking William Dalrymple?